They called him the Devil Horse, too wild to live. The town was ready to put him down, until a forgotten girl, hungry and alone, walked into his pen with nothing but silence. What happened next left ranchers, neighbors, and even the sheriff speechless. This is the story of a bond no rope could tie, and a fight that would change not just one girl and one horse, but an entire town forever. The wind swept across the wide plains of Wyoming, carrying with it the dry scent of dust and sagebrush. It rattled the tin roofs of the small town and bent the tall grass until it looked like waves rolling over the earth. On the far edge of the Carter Ranch, behind a tall wooden fence, the ground trembled beneath the hooves of a horse that no one dared to approach. His name was Midnight, a coal-black stallion, broad-chested and furious, his mane tangled like storm clouds. People in town whispered that he was cursed. Others simply called him wild beyond saving. Whatever the name, everyone agreed on one thing. The horse was dangerous, and his days were numbered. That morning, men from the ranch had gathered at the fence, their eyes watchful and weary. Midnight paced in circles. Teeth bared, ears pinned back. He charged at anyone who dared to step too close, slamming his hooves against the wood with a force that made it groan. A younger worker muttered under his breath, "He'll kill someone one of these days." And though no one answered, the silence carried agreement. Word had already spread. Sam Carter, the ranch owner, was considering putting the horse down. A decision like that carried weight, but most believed it was the only choice left. Hidden behind a crumbling stack of hay bales, a thin girl crouched low, her knees pulled to her chest. Her name was Emily, though few in town bothered to remember it. Barefoot and wrapped in a worn flannel shirt that was too big for her, she pressed her face between the gaps in the wood to glimpse the stallion. Her stomach growled from another day without a proper meal. But hunger wasn't the sharpest pain she carried. It was the loneliness, the way people turned their eyes away from her, as if she didn't exist. Emily had been living on scraps, half-eaten sandwiches left behind at the diner, bruised fruit tossed in the trash behind the grocery. Nights, she slept in the loft of an abandoned barn on the edge of town, curling into herself against the cold. She had learned quickly how to avoid the sheriff, who didn't want stray kids around, and how to run fast when the boys from Main Street decided to amuse themselves by throwing rocks at her. But no matter how fast she ran, she couldn't outrun the hollow feeling of being unwanted. It was that same feeling she saw burning in the eyes of Midnight. The stallion wasn't just angry, he was afraid. She recognized it instantly, the way fear can twist into violence when no one bothers to understand. And in a way that she couldn't put into words, Emily felt a pull toward him, as if they shared the same wound. That night, the town was quiet. A thin crescent moon hung over the horizon, and the ranch lay still. Workers slept in their bunks, and even the dogs seemed weary. Emily crept through the sagebrush, careful not to snap a twig. She slipped through a gap in the fence and stopped just a few yards from the dark figure looming in the pen. Midnight snorted, his nostrils flaring, hooves striking the ground. Emily froze. Her heart hammered in her chest, but she didn't run. She lowered herself slowly onto the dirt, folding her legs and setting her hands flat on the ground. She didn't reach out, didn't speak. She just sat, letting the silence stretch. Midnight's eyes, sharp as shards of obsidian, fixed on her. The minutes crawled by, her breaths shallow and steady. Finally, The stallion tossed his head, pawed at the ground, and then, unexpectedly, stilled. He stood watching her, sides heaving, but he didn't charge. Emily's throat ached with unshed tears. For the first time in what felt like forever, she didn't feel invisible. Someone, or something, had seen her. The world seemed to narrow to just the two of them, a forgotten child and a forsaken horse, breathing the same cold night air. When she finally rose and slipped away into the shadows, her chest carried a fragile warmth she hadn't known before. Midnight had not driven her out. He had allowed her presence. And for Emily, that was enough to make her believe, if only for a moment, that she still belonged somewhere. The sun rose over the town of Willow Creek, spilling gold light across cracked sidewalks and leaning telephone poles. For most people, morning meant chores, hot coffee, or the ringing bell of the diner at Main Street. For Emily, it meant another day of being invisible. She shuffled along the edge of the road, arms crossed tightly around her chest, her bare feet numb against the frost that lingered in the dirt. Passing townsfolk barely spared her a glance. When they did, it was only to frown or mutter under their breath, as though her very presence was an inconvenience. At the diner, the smell of bacon and biscuits wafted through the swinging doors. Emily pressed herself against the wall, waiting until the cook's voice carried from the kitchen, calling orders. When a young boy in a baseball cap walked out with a plate too full for his hands, a biscuit tumbled onto the ground. The boy kicked it aside and didn't look back. Emily darted forward, grabbed it, and tucked it close to her chest, as if it were treasure. Before she could sneak away, the owner of the diner stepped outside. His apron was stained, his hands thick from years of kneading dough. "Hey, get out of here, girl!" he barked. He flung a rag in her direction. Emily flinched and ran, biscuit clutched tightly in her palm. She didn't stop until she reached the far side of town, behind the abandoned grain mill. There, she crouched in the weeds and devoured the biscuit. It was dry, crumbs sticking to her lips, but it filled the hollow space in her stomach just enough. The town's laughter and music drifted from a distance, but here in the shadows, Emily's world was silent. She hugged her knees and rocked slightly, whispering to herself to keep from feeling the emptiness. Every corner of Willow Creek reminded her she was an outsider. Children her age passed by in groups, backpacks bouncing as they headed for school. Emily had never been inside those classrooms. Sometimes she would linger near the playground fence, watching the swing chains rattle in the wind, listening to the shrieks of laughter she would never join. When the children noticed her, they whispered, some pointing, others tossing cruel words. Rat girl, dumpster kid. She had learned to stare at the ground until they lost interest. On the ranch's edge, life was no different. Ranch hands drove cattle through the fields, their shouts and whistles carrying far on the wind. They never noticed Emily crouched near the fence line, or if they did, they pretended not to. She was a shadow on the earth, a figure best ignored. Except when midnight appeared, his black frame restless behind the wooden rails, his snorts echoing like thunder. The men spat curses at him, tossed ropes and sticks to keep him at bay. "That devil horse'll break someone's neck," one man said. They spoke about midnight the same way people spoke about her, with fear, with dismissal, with no thought of what lay beneath the surface. As the days passed, Emily began to move with more caution. She knew too well that even standing too long in the wrong place could draw suspicion. The sheriff had warned her once, "We don't need strays hanging around." His voice was cold, his boots planted firmly on the porch of the general store. Emily had nodded, shrinking back until she disappeared into the alley. She knew he wasn't just talking about dogs. That night, when the air was still and the stars flickered like scattered embers across the sky, Emily found herself wandering again. Hunger gnawed at her, but something else drove her feet toward the Carter Ranch. She slipped past the barbed wire fence and crouched low in the tall grass. Midnight's pen stood in the distance, his shadow moving back and forth. The wood creaked with each strike of his hooves. Emily stayed outside the fence this time, simply watching. Midnight's breath rose in white clouds against the dark. His muscles rippled as he turned sharply, nostrils wide, ears flat. For a moment, their eyes caught again through the slats of wood. Emily felt the air catch in her throat. She wasn't sure if he recognized her from the night before, but she recognized something in him. Rage, yes, but also despair. The same kind that settled in her bones when she thought too long about the family she had lost. She pressed her hand against the fence, not to reach for him, but to steady herself. She whispered softly, almost too quiet for even her own ears, "I see you." The horse snorted, tossing his head, but he didn't charge. Emily let her hand drop and leaned back into the grass, eyes stinging with tears. Back in town, no one would have cared if she disappeared. She could vanish one day, and the world would move on unchanged. But here, with midnight's restless shadow shifting under the moonlight, Emily felt an odd certainty. If no one else could see her, maybe this horse did. And in the silence of that thought, for the first time in days, she didn't feel entirely alone. The night carried a stillness that felt almost unnatural. Willow Creek usually hummed with the noises of ranch life, dogs barking, cattle lowing, the faint jangle of chains. But this evening seemed to hold its breath. Emily moved through the tall grass like a shadow, her small frame slipping between the stalks without a sound. She knew the rhythms of the ranch now, knew when the men were asleep, and the lights in the bunkhouse dimmed. It was the only time she dared to come close, when the land itself seemed to fold in on silence. She carried nothing with her, no food, no blanket, only the raw pull that drew her back to the pen. Midnight was there, black against black, his figure barely visible except for the glint of moonlight across his mane. He moved restlessly, circling, stamping at the dirt, as though some invisible force pressed against his skin. Emily stopped at the fence, her breath clouding in the cold. Her chest tightened, the same way it always did when she was about to run from a group of boys or from the sheriff's sharp eyes. Yet something inside refused to move. She climbed through the loose plank she had discovered days earlier, her heart pounding so hard it felt like the earth itself could hear it. The pen smelled of dust and sweat, of wood soaked with old rain. Midnight swung his head toward her instantly, ears sharp, his body coiled like a spring. He pawed the ground and gave a sound that was half warning, half question. Emily's knees trembled, but she forced herself not to retreat. Instead, she lowered herself to the ground, folding her legs, setting her palms flat against the dirt. For long moments, nothing happened. The air was thick, filled with the rough sound of midnight's breathing and the faint whisper of wind through the grass. Emily kept her eyes down, not daring to meet his gaze directly. She had learned that lesson on the streets. Sometimes looking someone in the eye was enough to provoke a blow, so she stared at the dirt between them, willing her heartbeat to slow. Midnight circled once, twice, his hooves crunching against the earth. He stopped 3 yards from her, head high, chest expanding with every breath. Emily lifted her face slowly, cautiously. Their eyes met. In that instant, something unspoken passed between them. The stallion's gaze was sharp, but beneath the anger there was a flicker. Something she recognized too well. Fear. Loneliness. A desperate kind of defiance that only came from being cornered too many times. Emily's lips parted, though she didn't mean to speak. Her voice came out in a whisper. "I'm not here to hurt you." The words were fragile, swept away almost instantly by the wind, but Midnight's ears flicked toward her as if he had heard. She stayed that way for what felt like hours. Every sound, every breath seemed magnified, the rustle of her shirt in the breeze, the scrape of his hoof against the earth, the quiet hum of crickets somewhere beyond the fence. At one point, Midnight lowered his head slightly, exhaling in a heavy burst. The sound made her chest ache. She wanted to reach out, to bridge the distance, but she knew better. Touch was for people who belonged, and she had learned long ago she did not. So she sat still, silent and small, letting him decide. When Midnight turned his body and lay down in the dirt, his back toward her, Emily's breath caught. She didn't move, didn't dare. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was something else, a surrender of vigilance, a fleeting crack in his armor. She watched him from where she sat, her hands curled in the dust, and for the first time in her life, she felt a strange safety in the company of another living being. The night deepened, stars spilling thick over the plains. Emily's eyes grew heavy, but she forced herself to stay awake, memorizing the sound of Midnight's breathing. She wanted to carry it back with her, to hold on to it in the cold loft of the abandoned barn where she usually slept. It was proof she wasn't entirely alone in the world. When dawn finally tinged the horizon with pale light, Emily rose carefully, her limbs stiff from sitting on the ground. Midnight stirred, but did not rise. She slipped through the broken plank and back into the grass. By the time the ranch hands began their morning chores, she was already gone. No trace left, except the faint imprint of her small body in the dirt where she had sat. As she walked back toward the edges of town, hunger gnawed at her belly again, but it felt different now. She carried with her something more powerful than bread or warmth. Midnight had not driven her away. Midnight had allowed her near, and for a girl no one in town could even look at, that meant more than she dared to admit. The Carter Ranch was awake before the sun, as it always was. The clang of buckets, the bark of dogs, and the creak of gates filled the chilly dawn air. Dust swirled up from boots stomping across the yard, and cattle lowed from distant pastures. Yet beneath the rhythm of work hung a tension that no one dared voice. Midnight had grown more restless, more unpredictable, and the men whispered that he was nothing but a storm waiting to break. Sam Carter walked from the porch of his ranch house with his hat pulled low, his coat buttoned against the morning wind. He was a man used to making hard choices, the kind that shaped land and people alike. His boots crunched against gravel as he made his way toward the corral where Midnight raged. Hank, his foreman, was already there, leaning against the fence with a coil of rope over his shoulder. His face bore the smug weariness of a man who had long given up hope. "Morning, Sam," Hank said, his voice gravelly from years of shouting commands. He nodded toward the horse. "He's at it again. Tried to bite through the rails earlier. If we don't deal with him soon, someone's going to pay the price." Sam rested his hands on the fence, his eyes locked on the stallion. Midnight's muscles rippled under his black coat as he spun in tight circles, ears pinned back, hooves striking with violent rhythm. His nostrils flared, white foam at his lips, the image of fury made flesh. For a moment, Sam saw not just a horse, but a force of nature, untamed and unwilling. The ranch hands gathered around, muttering their agreement. One younger man rubbed the bandage on his arm where Midnight had snapped at him days earlier. Another spat into the dirt, muttering about curses and bad luck. The air buzzed with fear disguised as bravado. Sam's jaw tightened. "This can't go on," he said flatly. "He's a danger, not just to the men, but to the ranch itself." "A beast like that's no use to anyone." Hank's lips curved into a grim smile. "So, we put him down?" A heavy silence followed. Even the men who had cursed the horse fell quiet, waiting for the decision to be spoken out loud. Sam tipped his hat back, revealing the lines etched deep into his brow. "I'll call the vet." Monday morning. He'll be gone before the sun's high. His voice was steady, but in the stillness, it carried the weight of finality. A murmur swept through the group, some relieved, others uneasy, but none dared to argue. Sam Carter's word was law on this land. From the shadows of the barn, Emily pressed herself against the rough boards, her breath caught in her throat. She had been searching for scraps again, hoping to find something left behind in the feed room. Instead, she had stumbled upon the gathering and the words that would change everything. Her small fingers clutched at the splintered wood as if it could anchor her. The phrase repeated in her mind with cruel clarity. Monday morning. The horse would be gone. Midnight, the only creature who had allowed her near, the only living thing that had not pushed her away, was marked for death. The men dispersed, some shaking their heads, others laughing bitterly, eager to be rid of the devil horse. Hank lingered behind, spitting into the dirt before muttering, "Good riddance." He gave the corral a final glare, then followed the others. When the yard emptied, Emily slipped from her hiding place. Her heart raced as she crept closer to the fence, her eyes never leaving Midnight. The stallion pawed the earth, tossing his head, still brimming with restless fury. To anyone else, he was danger, embodied. To Emily, he was something far more familiar. She pressed her forehead against the wooden rail, whispering words meant only for him. "They don't see you. They don't even try. But I do." Her voice cracked, her throat tight with panic. "They're going to kill you." I heard them. Midnight stopped his circling for a fleeting moment, turning one dark eye toward her. His breath rose in heavy clouds, each exhale a low rumble. Emily's chest ached with the strange sense that he understood, if not the words, then the fear in her tone. She pulled back suddenly, her hands trembling. What could she do? She was just a girl no one wanted, a ghost in her own town. She had no power, no voice strong enough to change a ranch owner's mind. And yet the thought of doing nothing was unbearable. Emily retreated into the tall grass, her mind whirling. The decision had been made, carved into the air like a cruel promise. Midnight would die in just a few days, but deep inside, a spark had lit, fragile and trembling, but real. She had been unseen for so long, invisible in the eyes of the world. But maybe, just maybe, she could choose to see him. And maybe that choice meant she couldn't let him go without a fight. As the sun climbed over the horizon, washing the plains in harsh light, Emily made her way back toward the edges of town. The biscuit from yesterday sat like a stone in her stomach, but hunger was nothing compared to the weight pressing against her chest. Monday morning loomed ahead like a shadow, and with each step, the spark within her grew brighter, refusing to die. The days slipped by with a cruel certainty. Monday was coming, and with it, the end of midnight. Emily felt every hour tick like the swing of a hammer. The ranch hands spoke of it casually, like it was already decided, like the stallion was nothing more than a broken fence post ready to be hauled away. She carried those words with her as she drifted through town, scavenging for food, but her thoughts were never far from the corral. That evening, when the last streaks of sunset bled into the horizon, Emily made her choice. She couldn't wait for anyone to save midnight. No one would. She would go back to him, even if all she could offer was the comfort of being seen before the world took him away. She slipped through the pasture fence when the bunkhouse had gone quiet. The stars spread thick above her, and the smell of sage mixed with the sharper scent of horse sweat. The corral loomed ahead, its wooden rails rising like the bars of a cage. Inside, Midnight paced, his hooves thudding a restless rhythm against the earth. His black coat caught the moonlight, turning him into a creature carved of shadow and fire. Emily hesitated at the fence, the memory of Sam Carter's voice ringing in her ears. Monday morning. Her hands shook as she pulled herself through the gap. This time, she carried a crust of bread she had stolen from a windowsill in town. Stale, but precious, she held it close, then dropped it gently on the ground between them. Midnight reacted instantly, his head jerking toward the movement, ears pricked, body tense. He gave a warning snort, stomping once. Emily sank to the ground, legs folded, keeping her body small. She whispered softly, not to command, not to coax, but to confess. They're going to take you away. I don't want that. I don't want to be the only one left. Her words trembled in the air, fragile as moth wings. For a long moment, Midnight did nothing. Then he stepped closer. Not much, just one careful stride. He sniffed at the bread but didn't eat it, his eyes fixed on her instead. Emily felt her chest swell with something she hadn't known in years. Hope. She began to talk more freely, her voice threading through the silence of the night. She told him about her mother, who had left one morning without saying goodbye. She told him about the nights she spent curled up in the loft of the abandoned barn, shivering under the rafters. She spoke of the ache in her belly and the sting of words hurled at her by the children in town. Every confession loosened something inside her, like a knot slowly unraveling. Midnight flicked his ears, his breathing steadying as he listened. He didn't charge, didn't turn away. He simply remained, as though her pain anchored him. Emily felt tears slide down her cheeks, hot against the cold air. She wiped them with the back of her hand and whispered, "You're like me. They don't understand you either." The stallion lowered his head, almost to the ground, exhaling a long, heavy breath. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it wasn't fury either. It was something in between. A truce, unspoken, but powerful. Emily pressed her hand against the dirt, resisting the urge to reach for him. She had no right, not yet. All she could do was stay. The minutes stretched into hours. The moon rose high, then drifted west. Midnight circled less, finally standing near the far side of the pen, watching her with an intensity that felt like recognition. Emily leaned back, exhausted but unwilling to leave. She whispered stories until her voice grew hoarse. About the time she found a penny on the road and pretended it was gold. About the old music box her mother once kept on a shelf. She told him dreams she barely admitted to herself, having a room of her own, a bed with sheets, someone to say goodnight. By the time dawn brushed pink across the sky, Emily knew she had to go. The ranch would wake soon, and if they found her inside, Hank's fury would be swift. She rose slowly, her legs stiff, and backed toward the gap in the fence. Midnight followed her with his eyes but did not move. She paused one last time before slipping out, her voice low but steady. "I'll come back. I promise." Back in town, the world treated her the same. Shopkeepers shooed her from their steps, children laughed at her tangled hair, the sheriff cast suspicious glances. But inside, something had shifted. Emily carried with her the weight of that night, the fragile bond formed in the darkness. It was a secret no one else knew, a connection she could barely explain. Midnight wasn't just a wild horse anymore. He was proof that she wasn't invisible. Not to everyone. And as Monday drew closer, Emily clung to that truth like it was the only thing keeping her alive. The air over Willow Creek was heavy with dust and heat, though the calendar said it was still spring. The pastures shimmered beneath the sun, and even the cattle shifted slowly, as if weighed down by the sky itself. Emily moved through the tall weeds along the edge of the Carter Ranch, her shoulders hunched, her eyes scanning for any sign of the ranch hands. She had returned to Midnight night after night, careful and silent, never daring to speak of it to anyone. The bond between them was fragile, something sacred she carried in her chest like a flame cupped in trembling hands. That afternoon, the yard was unusually quiet. Most of the workers had taken the cattle farther out, leaving only the distant sound of a tractor groaning across the fields. Emily used the stillness as her chance. She slid through the gap in the corral, clutching a stale roll she had scavenged, and crouched in her familiar place on the packed dirt. Midnight was there, restless but calmer than she remembered from the first days. His black coat shimmered with sweat, his eyes sharp, his breath steaming in short bursts. Emily whispered to him, her voice weaving through the silence. "I told you I'd come back." "I always will." The words felt dangerous, as if saying them too loud might shatter what they had built. Midnight pawed the earth, his ears flicking forward at the sound of her voice. For the first time, he did not retreat to the far side of the pen. He remained close, his body taut but steady. She spoke of the things she could never say to anyone else. How the sheriff looked at her like she was trouble before she even opened her mouth. How she sometimes woke in the barn with her arms wrapped so tightly around herself it felt like she might vanish if she let go. Midnight seemed to listen, his great chest rising and falling in rhythm with her words. And for Emily, that was enough. What she didn't know was that someone else was listening. Lucy Turner had been sent by her mother to fetch water from the ranch pump. She was about Emily's age, though the two girls had rarely exchanged more than a glance. Lucy came from a family that still had meals on the table, clean sheets, and a mother who brushed her hair at night. She had always seen Emily at the edges of town, dirty, barefoot, slipping in and out of alleys. To Lucy, she was like a character from the cautionary tales her grandmother told. But when she rounded the corner of the barn and saw Emily crouched inside the corral, facing the wild stallion everyone feared, her breath caught in her throat. Lucy froze, gripping the handle of the empty bucket so hard it squeaked. Midnight was close enough to strike, his massive head lowered, nostrils flaring. One wrong move, and the girl everyone mocked would be trampled into the dirt. Lucy wanted to scream, to run for help, but something held her still. She had never seen a horse so calm. Not with anyone, certainly not with this girl who had nothing. Emily didn't notice her at first. She was too wrapped up in the secret rhythm between herself and midnight. But then a faint gasp reached her ears, and she spun around. There, standing just beyond the corral, was Lucy, her wide eyes locked on the impossible scene. Panic surged through Emily's chest. Her secret was no longer hers. She scrambled to her feet, her hands shaking. "Don't tell," she whispered harshly, desperation cutting through her voice. "Please, Lucy. Don't tell anyone." Lucy blinked, torn between fear and curiosity. How? How are you doing that? He should have killed you by now." "I'm not doing anything," Emily said, her voice cracking. "I'm just here. He lets me—" She stepped closer, her body blocking Lucy's view of the stallion as if she could shield him from the world's eyes. "If they find out, they'll take him away even sooner." "Promise me you won't say anything." Lucy hesitated. She had been raised to obey adults, to trust that grown-ups knew best. Every ranch hand, every neighbor, even the sheriff had called the horse a danger, a curse. And yet before her eyes, the curse stood still as stone, his dark gaze fixed not on her but on Emily, as though tethered by something invisible. Finally, Lucy nodded. "I won't tell. But I want to see." Again, Emily's chest eased, though only slightly. She knew it was a risk to let anyone in. But there was something in Lucy's voice, a need, maybe, or the same kind of longing Emily herself felt. "Then you can't talk." "Not to anyone. Not even your folks," Lucy agreed, though her voice trembled with the weight of a promise she wasn't sure she could keep. She left quickly after that, Bucket swinging at her side, her mind spinning with the secret she carried. Emily sank back to the ground, her body trembling. Midnight shifted closer, exhaling softly as if he sensed her fear. She whispered to him again, her words almost lost to the breeze. "It's not just ours anymore. But I'll protect it. I swear the bond had been fragile before, a thin thread spun in the dark. Now, with a witness, it was something else, something dangerous. Secrets were heavy, and in Willow Creek, they never stayed buried for long." The morning sun cast long shadows across the Carter Ranch, burning away the mist that clung to the pastures. Emily lingered near the edge of the property, waiting for the familiar rhythm of the ranch to quiet. She had been careful these past nights, slipping into the corral when no one was watching, speaking in whispers that only midnight could hear. But caution had its limits, and secrets, no matter how carefully guarded, had a way of slipping through cracks. By late afternoon, when the workers' shouts faded into the distance, and the fields swallowed most of them whole, Emily saw her chance. She darted across the dirt yard, heart pounding, and squeezed through the gap in the fence. Midnight turned his head sharply, ears flicking at her entrance, but he did not charge. His restless pacing slowed. Emily dropped to the ground the way she always did, folding herself small. "I'm back," she whispered, her voice fragile, yet certain. "I told you I would be." The stallion snorted, pawing once, but the wild anger that once radiated from him had dulled around her. It wasn't calm, not yet, but it was no longer pure fury. Emily leaned forward, her hands in the dirt, telling him stories she had carried like stones in her chest. She spoke of nights spent cold and alone, of days when hunger chewed at her belly. Each word was a release, and midnight, impossibly, seemed to hold the weight with her. The moment stretched, delicate as glass. And then a sharp voice cut through the air. "What the hell are you doing in there?" Emily froze, her stomach dropping to the ground beneath her. Hank stood at the fence, a coil of rope hanging from his hand, his face dark with disbelief and rage. He had come back from the fields early, and she hadn't noticed. His eyes flicked between her small frame and the massive black horse looming just a few feet away. Emily scrambled to her feet, but Hank was faster. He swung the gate open and stormed inside, his boots pounding against the dirt. Midnight reared back with a furious neigh, hooves slamming down so hard the earth seemed to shudder. Hank lunged for Emily, yanking her by the arm. "Are you out of your damn mind?" he barked, shaking her so hard her teeth rattled. Emily twisted, trying to break free, but his grip was iron. Midnight shrieked, his body surging forward. The stallion's hooves crashed against the ground, ears pinned, his chest thrust out like a warrior ready for battle. Hank cursed and dragged Emily toward the gate. "You want to get yourself killed? You want to bring him down on all of us?" Emily's cry broke into the air, a sound more of desperation than fear. Midnight surged again, slamming into the fence, eyes blazing. The ranch hands, drawn by the noise, came running. They stopped short at the sight, the wild stallion thrashing, the foreman dragging a filthy, barefoot girl by the arm. "What's going on?" one shouted. Another cursed under his breath. Hank shoved Emily through the gate, his grip leaving a red mark on her thin arm. "This little rat's been sneaking into the pen," talking to the beast like it's her pet. His words were laced with contempt, but beneath them was something else. Fear. The men exchanged uneasy glances. Midnight was still crashing against the fence, his nostrils flaring, his eyes locked not on the men, but on the girl they had just dragged out. Emily stood trembling, her head bowed but her jaw clenched tight. The dust clung to her face, streaked with sweat and tears. She wanted to shout, to tell them they didn't understand, but the words caught in her throat. She knew whatever she said would only make things worse. "Get her off this ranch," Hank spat, shoving her toward the dirt yard. "Next time it won't be just her bones broken." "That horse will kill someone for sure." Emily stumbled, catching herself on her hands and knees. She heard the workers muttering, felt their eyes burning into her back. She didn't dare look up. Midnight's furious cries echoed behind her, each one like a call she couldn't answer. Don Ernesto's voice, the name everyone used for Sam Carter when speaking with a mix of respect and fear, broke the tension. Enough. He had come from the porch, his frame tall, his face hard in the setting sun. The men fell silent as he surveyed the scene, the trembling girl, the furious horse, the foreman's scowl. Emily's heart thundered. If Sam Carter cast her out, there would be no way back. Midnight would be left alone, and Monday would come without mercy. Sam's gaze lingered on her longer than she expected. He saw the dirt, the bare feet, the defiance barely holding back her tears. Then he turned to Hank. "Take her out of the corral. Don't touch her again." His voice was flat, final. Hank's jaw tightened, but he stepped back. Emily's knees shook with relief, though the fear still burned in her chest. Midnight had stopped thrashing, but his body pressed against the fence, his eyes never leaving her. The workers shifted uneasily, whispering among themselves. No one had ever seen the stallion so fixed on anything but destruction, and in that moment they realized what Hank had dragged into the light. The wild horse and the unwanted girl were bound by something none of them understood. Emily wrapped her arms around herself, trembling, but inside her heart ached with a strange new certainty. She could no longer hide in shadows. The world had seen. and nothing would ever be the same again. By morning, the story had slipped its bridle and run wild through Willow Creek. It started at the feed store, two ranch hands lowering their voices as they filled sacks of grain, and galloped to the barber shop, the church steps, the diner where the bell above the door wouldn't stop clanging. "That Carter girl, no, not a Carter, the stray," someone said. "Went right in the pen with the black devil and lived to tell it." Eyebrows rose, heads tilted, and a little fear crept into the awe like a snake into a henhouse. At the diner, coffee steamed in thick mugs, while the cook banged pans hard enough to make the counter tremble. Men hunched over plates, pretending to read the paper, listening instead to the woman in the corner booth who had a cousin on the ranch. Foreman found her in there, barefoot, skinny as a broomstick. Horse had his eyes on her like she was the last star in the sky. A few laughed the way people do when they're scared. The owner shook his head, muttered something about trouble following certain kinds of kids. Sheriff Dalton parked outside the general store and tipped his hat to no one in particular. By noon, he'd heard a half-dozen versions of the same tale, each bigger than the last. He didn't like things that didn't fit neat in a report. Horses were either safe or dangerous. People were either lawful or not. That gray in-between, where a wild stallion stood still for a girl nobody claimed, that was a color the sheriff didn't care to see. On the ranch, the wind pressed low and hot, worrying at the corrals. Sam Carter stood on the porch with a cup he didn't drink, watching the yard with narrowed eyes. Midnight tossed his head in the pen, but the rage that usually rolled off him in waves had thinned into a taut restlessness. Sam had seen it yesterday when Hank yanked the girl out, the way the horse had locked on her like a compass finding north. It unsettled him, that focus, that impossible calm that lasted only as long as she was near. Hank stomped up the steps, hat in hand, rope coiled like a threat. "Words out," he said, jaw tight. "Folks comin' to gawk." Sheriff might show this afternoon. "I say we move it up." "Move what up?" Sam asked, though he knew. "The appointment. Before the crowd turns this place into a circus. Horse like that doesn't get better. He gets lucky. And lucky for him means someone gets hurt." Hank's voice had the scratch of sand in it. "Monday's too far." "Make it sooner." Sam stared past him at the pasture. A thin dust devil spiraled and died. "Call doctor." "Leland," he said at last, the words scraping his throat. "Tell him tomorrow at first light." He heard how soft the decision sounded, and hated it. Hard choices were supposed to be clean. This one felt like trying to cut rope with a dull knife. Hank nodded once, satisfied, and went to make the call. The screen door slapped behind him. Sam stayed where he was, the cup cooling in his hand. In the pen, Midnight drifted toward the fence and stood, breathing steady, watching the empty yard like he expected someone to step into it. By late afternoon, cars began to slow at the ranch entrance. People didn't pull in, not yet. They rolled down their windows and peered through dust as if the horse might rise up like a storm cloud and show them what a legend looked like before it ended. Two boys on bikes coasted to the fence, dared each other to touch it, then pedaled off, loud on purpose. A woman from the church left a folded blanket at the gate with a note that said simply, "For the girl." No name, no sermon. Emily kept to the edges, watching from the rusted shell of an old grain wagon. Word had reached her like a slap. The date had changed. Not Monday. Tomorrow. The ground shifted under her, and for a heartbeat she thought she might vanish the way she did in town. Just fade out, leave no trace. But the pen's rails were staked in the same earth her feet clung to, and the sight of that black shape moving inside them held her together. She waited until the hands drifted toward the distant pastures again, until shadows grew long and blue. Then she slipped from her hiding place and cut across the yard, skirting the bunkhouse where men's laughter tried to drown out their nerves. The corral rose ahead, wood darkened by years of weather and sweat. Midnight turned at her approach, ears forward, breath rolling from his nostrils like steam from a train. "I heard," Emily said, low and even, as if steady words could pin the sky in place. "It's sooner." She rested her forearms on the top rail, keeping her body outside the pen. She had promised herself that after Hank found her, she wouldn't cross that line in daylight. Promises were thin things, but they were what she had. "I don't know how to stop it yet." Midnight shifted closer, not with the headlong charge that had once defined him, but with the guarded weight of something listening. Dust lifted at his feet. The air smelled like sun-warmed wood and the bitter edge of fear. Emily told him about the stairs in town, about the way people said her name like it wasn't hers. She told him she had woken from a short, hard sleep, with her hands clenched and her jaw aching, because dreams were places she couldn't protect him. A throat cleared behind her. Emily spun, ready to run. Lucy stood there, freckled face flushed from pedaling too hard, a backpack thumping her side. She looked over her shoulder as if the road might follow her. Then she climbed the fence and perched on the lower rail, eyes wide but steady. "I brought something," Lucy said, rummaging in the pack. She pulled out 2 apples, small and bruised, and held one out. "For him, or for you?" Emily stared, then took the apple like it was fragile. "You can't be here," she whispered. "If they see you—" "They won't," Lucy said quickly, though she didn't sound certain. She glanced at the bunkhouse. "Mama sent me for flour." "I took the long way." She leaned forward, peering through the slats at midnight. "Is it true? They're doing it tomorrow?" Emily swallowed. The word stuck before it came loose. "Yes." Lucy set her jaw in a way that made her look older. "Then we need to know when, not just the day." The time she dug deeper in her pack and pulled out a folded note. "I heard Hank on the phone with Dr. Leland when I dropped off a pie this morning. Mama makes me wait in the kitchen. No one sees me there." She handed Emily the paper. "Dawn." He said dawn like it was a secret code. The paper trembled between Emily's fingers. Dawn shrank the night into something thin and sharp. Less time to be brave. Less time to be anything at all. She stared at the pen where midnight stood, his eye reflecting a tilted piece of sky. "Thank you," she said, and meant it in a way that filled her chest. Lucy nodded, relief and fear blending in her expression. The 2 girls sat like sentries, the corral rails a line they did not cross. Emily rolled the apple toward the slats and let it rest there. Midnight stretched his neck, sniffed, then nudged it gently so it rocked and settled. He did not bite. He looked at Emily as if the apple were a question he'd answer later. A truck rumbled up the drive, kicking dust into the air. Sheriff Dalton eased to a stop, boots hitting the ground with the slow certainty of a man who expected obedience. Hank met him halfway, pointing at the pen, talking low and hard. The sheriff shaded his eyes and studied the stallion. "Tomorrow's best," Emily heard him say, "before people make trouble." Lucy's breath hitched. Emily stayed very still, anger and dread rising together like twin flames. Trouble, she thought. That's what they called it when fear needed a different name. Midnight lifted his head and blew, the sound clear as a trumpet. The sheriff looked toward the fence where the girls crouched, but the light slanted just right, and they were part shadow, part wood. He turned away. When the truck pulled out, the sun was sliding toward the ridge, spilling copper across the field. A hush followed, the kind that falls before a storm. Emily slid down from the rail and faced Lucy. "If you can't come tomorrow, if you can't get away—" "I'll be there," Lucy said quickly. "I'll find a way." She slung the backpack over her shoulder. "You saved him already once. I saw it. I'll stand with you if—" She didn't finish. Some promises are too big for words. They parted at the edge of the yard, Lucy pedaling fast, Emily folding the note until it was no bigger than her thumb, tucking it into the tiny pocket sewn on the inside of her flannel. The sky deepened to violet. Lights blinked on in the bunkhouse. A coyote called far off, thin as thread. Emily walked back to the fence one last time. "Dawn," she said to Midnight, as if telling him could slow the earth's turning. "I'll be here." The stallion stood with his weight square, ears soft, watching her the way a lost traveler watches a lantern. Beyond the ranch, the town settled into its evening rituals, porch swings creaking, radios humming old songs, dinner plates clinking. But the air held a charge that didn't belong to weather. Willow Creek was waiting for something it couldn't name. A reckoning shaped like a girl and a horse under a sky that was running out of night. The air before sunrise was thin and sharp, the kind that stung lungs and stiffened fingers. A pale gray light stretched over the Wyoming plains, pushing back the night, but not yet warm enough to ease its grip. Emily's breath clouded in the chill as she hurried across the field, her bare feet numb, her mind locked on the note Lucy had given her. Dawn. The word pulsed in her chest like a heartbeat. From the ridge above the ranch, she could already see figures gathering near the corral. Ranch hands stood with their arms crossed, hats pulled low, voices rough in the early quiet. A few townsfolk had come too, curious eyes squinting through the dust. Word had spread farther than Emily feared. Now it wasn't just the ranch. It was the town, waiting for a spectacle. Midnight was already raging in the pen. His black coat shone with sweat, though the morning was cold, and each slam of his hooves against the earth rang like a drumbeat. He threw his head high, teeth bared, muscles rolling with unspent fury. A pair of men kept their distance, rope in hand, waiting for the signal. The veterinarian's truck stood nearby, its back door closed, the outline of a heavy case visible through the window. Sam Carter leaned against the fence, his face carved hard, his hat shadowing his eyes. Hank stood beside him, stiff and certain, though sweat slicked his brow. "Best to get it done quick," Hank muttered, "before he takes someone's head off." Emily froze at the edge of the yard, heart racing so hard she thought it might split her chest. For a moment, she couldn't move. Her legs felt carved from stone. The people, the ropes, the cold certainty in their voices. It was all too big for her small frame. But then Midnight reared, striking at the fence with a force that shook the rails, and his eyes, wild and blazing, locked with hers across the yard. Something inside her broke open. She bolted forward. "Wait!" Her voice cracked through the dawn, high and desperate. The men startled, turning as she ran, hair flying, flannel shirt flapping against her thin frame. Sam's eyes widened, but before he could speak, Emily had flung herself through the gate, landing hard on the dirt inside the corral. Chaos erupted. "Get her out of there!" Hank shouted, lunging forward. The ranch hands swore, some moving toward the fence, others stepping back in fear. The vet froze, case in hand, uncertain whether to advance or retreat. Emily scrambled to her feet, her knees scraped raw. She raised her arms, not to shield herself, but to hold the world back. Her voice shook, but carried, ringing louder than she thought possible. "If you want to kill him, you'll have to go through me first." The corral fell into stunned silence. The stallion, who only moments before had been a storm of hooves and rage, stopped mid-charge. His ears flicked, his chest heaving. Emily turned slowly toward him, tears stinging her eyes. "I'm here, Midnight," she whispered, though everyone heard. The black stallion lowered his head, nostrils flaring. He took one step toward her, then another, the dust curling around his legs. Emily stood trembling, but she did not move away. When he reached her, he pressed his massive head against her shoulder, his breath hot against her neck. Gasps rippled through the crowd, muttered prayers. Others clutched the fence rail as though it might anchor them to the earth. The horse that had broken bones, splintered rails, and terrified a town now stood still under the touch of a girl no one wanted. Sam Carter's jaw tightened. Hank swore under his breath, his face pale. The vet quietly closed his case, unsure of what he was witnessing. Emily buried her face against Midnight's neck, her voice breaking. "I won't let them take you. You're not a curse. You're not." Her small hands clung to his mane, fingers white with the effort of holding on. The stallion exhaled, long and deep, and folded his legs beneath him. He sank to the dirt beside her, a black mountain humbled. Emily slid down with him, her arms still wrapped around his head, her cheek pressed to the warmth of his coat. No one moved. Even the morning wind seemed to still, carrying only the sound of Emily's sobs and the low rumble of the stallion's breath. Finally, Sam spoke, his voice hoarse but steady. "Nobody touches him." The command cut clean through the silence. "Not today. Not ever, unless I say so." The ranch hands exchanged bewildered looks. Hank opened his mouth, but Sam's glare pinned him where he stood. Slowly, one by one, the men backed away from the fence. The vet turned, climbed into his truck, and drove off without a word. Emily lifted her head. Her face was streaked with dirt and tears, but her eyes burned with something fierce. Around her, the crowd had no words. Some saw madness, others a miracle, but all of them knew one truth. The wild horse had bowed to the girl no one saw. She rose slowly, brushing the dust from her knees, her hand never leaving Midnight's neck. She faced the fence, her chest rising and falling like she had carried the weight of the world and still stood. And though her voice was barely more than a whisper, everyone heard it. "He's mine as much as I am his." The days after the standoff at dawn were unlike anything Willow Creek had ever seen. For once, the talk at the diner wasn't about cattle prices or the weather, but about the girl who stood between a gun and the black stallion. Farmers lowered their voices when Emily's name slipped into conversation, unsure if she was a blessing or a curse. Children whispered about her on the playground, wide-eyed, daring each other to sneak to the ranch fence just to catch a glimpse of the pair everyone was calling the impossible. Emily tried to stay invisible as she always had, but invisibility was no longer possible. Every time she walked through town, heads turned. Some watched her with awe. others with suspicion. She didn't want either. She only wanted to slip back into shadows where no one expected anything from her. But her bond with Midnight had dragged her into the center of a stage she had never chosen. One afternoon, as she lingered near the feed shed with Lucy, brushing dust from her clothes and speaking in hushed tones, a car rolled up the gravel drive. It wasn't a ranch truck or a neighbor's pickup. It was a faded sedan, its muffler rattling, its windshield streaked with grime. Emily stiffened instantly, her stomach knotting before the door even opened. The woman who climbed out had the same eyes as Emily, tired, sharp, but dulled by something heavier. Her hair was tied up carelessly, her lipstick smudged, her sandals worn thin. She looked around with the air of someone not returning home, but retrieving something she had forgotten. Her gaze landed on Emily, and her smile came too quick, too shallow. "There you are," she said, voice too bright for the dust and silence of the ranch. "Emily." The girl's breath caught. Her throat felt dry as she whispered, "Mom?" The word left her lips brittle, as though it might crumble in the air. Lucy stepped back, uncertain, watching with wide eyes. The ranch hands nearby slowed their work, curiosity pulling them closer. Hank crossed his arms, his expression unreadable. Even Sam Carter emerged from the porch, his hat tilted low, his eyes narrowing at the sight of the stranger. The woman walked forward, heels sinking into the dirt. She reached for Emily's chin, tilting it upward. "You've grown." "Thinner, though. Don't they feed you here?" Her laugh was a brittle thing, without warmth. "Well, no matter. You're coming home with me now." Emily flinched at the touch, pulling away. Her heart pounded so hard it shook her chest. She searched the woman's face for something she remembered. Gentleness, safety, even regret. She found nothing but impatience. Sam stepped closer. "And who might you be?" The woman straightened, brushing dust from her blouse. "Her mother." "Who else?" The yard fell silent. Even the horses in the far pasture seemed to still. Hank raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Lucy bit her lip, looking at Emily. "Funny," Sam said evenly. "I don't recall seeing you around when this girl was starving in alleys. I don't recall anyone coming to claim her until she stood up to save a horse." The woman's eyes narrowed. "That's none of your business." "She's mine. Blood is blood." Emily's legs trembled. She wanted to speak, to shout that she wasn't an object to be taken and dropped at will. But the words stuck, clumsy and raw in her throat. She could only shake her head slightly, tears burning her eyes. Sam crossed his arms. "Blood may bind, but it doesn't prove care. You want to take her? Show me proof you can feed her, keep her safe. Give her better than she has now." His voice was sharp, slicing through the heavy air. The woman's mouth tightened. "I don't need to prove a damn thing. She's my child, and I'll be back tomorrow to take her. You'd better be ready." She turned on her heel, climbed back into the sedan, and drove off, leaving a choking trail of dust. When the sound faded, all eyes fell on Emily. Her face was pale, her fists clenched, her whole body shaking as though a storm raged beneath her skin. Midnight, who had been pacing in his pen through the entire scene, let out a piercing neigh that cut through the silence, echoing against the hills. Emily staggered toward the fence, pressing her forehead against the wood. Midnight pressed close, his dark eye fixed on her, as though he could see the weight of the moment pressing down. Her whisper was almost lost in the wind. "I can't go back." Not there, not ever. Sam watched from the porch, his jaw tight, his hand gripping the rail. He had seen many battles in his time, men against land, man against beast, but never one like this, a child against the chains of her own blood. He knew the days ahead would test more than courage. They would test whether Willow Creek had the heart to stand on the side of what was right, not just what was lawful. And as the sun dipped behind the ridge, painting the sky in copper and violet, Emily stayed at the fence with midnight, her hand resting on the wood, her breath uneven. The town might call it fate, others might call it madness, but to Emily it was clear. The fight wasn't just for the stallion anymore. It was for herself. The next day dawned with a sky that looked bruised, streaked with violet and gray, as though the heavens themselves sensed the weight pressing down on the Carter ranch. Emily had barely slept. She had lain awake in the loft of the old barn, staring at the rafters, listening to the mice scurry. Her mother's voice echoed in her skull, sharp, impatient, claiming her as if she were something lost and found, not someone who had endured nights of hunger and years of being unseen. By mid-morning, the sound of tires crunching gravel announced what Emily had feared. The same faded sedan rattled up the drive, dust curling around its tires. This time, her mother didn't bother with false cheer. She climbed out with a hard expression, her chin set, her stride purposeful. Townsfolk had followed, as they always did when whispers promised spectacle. They lined the fence at a distance, pretending to have business nearby, though everyone's eyes stayed fixed on the girl and the woman who claimed her. Sam Carter stepped out of the house, his hat low, his face unreadable. Hank hovered near the corral, arms crossed, muttering under his breath. Lucy stood a little apart from the crowd, clutching the strap of her satchel, her freckled face tense. Emily's mother stopped in the center of the yard. "I've come for her," she said, her voice carrying across the silence. "She's mine." It's time she came home. The words struck Emily like a stone. Home. The place her mother spoke of was nothing like the word suggested. Home was hunger, slammed doors, nights waiting for footsteps that never returned. Home was absence wrapped in bitterness. Her chest tightened as she looked at the woman who had given her life and nothing else. Sam's voice was steady but cold. "You've got the law on your side." "Side. That's true. But the law doesn't change what she's been through. You left her in alleys and barns, and now you walk in here demanding her back?" The woman's eyes flashed. "Don't talk to me about what you don't know." "She's mine." Blood don't lie. Emily felt dozens of eyes on her. The crowd waited, some with pity, others with judgment, hungry for the drama to unfold. Her throat tightened. She wanted to vanish into the dust, but Midnight was there behind the fence, his restless hooves striking the earth, his breath hot and fierce. His presence steadied her, as if the ground beneath her feet belonged to both of them now. Her mother stepped closer, reaching out as if to seize her arm. "Come on, Emily. Enough of this nonsense. Pack up whatever rags you've got. We're leaving." Emily backed away, her heart pounding so loudly it drowned the murmurs around her. Her legs shook, but she forced herself to raise her voice. "No." The word fell heavy, sharper than any shout. The crowd stiffened, stunned by the force in her small frame. Her mother blinked, thrown off balance. "What do you mean, no?" Emily's chest heaved, but she kept her eyes steady, her voice trembling yet strong. "I'm not going with you." "You left me. You didn't look for me, didn't care if I ate or froze. You only came back because people are talking about me now." Gasps rippled through the watchers. Sam's jaw clenched, but he didn't speak. He let the girl's voice carry its own weight. Her mother's face twisted, anger breaking through the mask. "I'm your mother." "You don't get to decide," Emily shook her head, tears streaking her dirt-stained cheeks. "Being a mother means staying. It means caring. You didn't. Midnight cared more by standing beside me than you ever did." She glanced at the stallion, who snorted and stamped as if answering her. The silence that followed was deeper than any words. Lucy's eyes filled with tears, her small hand pressed to her chest. The ranch hands shifted, uneasy, but moved. Even Hank, who had little sympathy for the girl, couldn't find his usual cruel remark. Her mother took another step forward, her voice breaking into a shout. "Emily!" But the girl stood firm, her back straight despite her trembling legs. "No, this is where I belong. Here, not with you." For a long moment, the two faced each other, one demanding control, the other demanding freedom. Then, with a sharp breath, the woman turned on her heel, storming back to the car. Dust spat from the tires as she drove away, leaving the yard wrapped in stunned quiet. Emily's knees nearly buckled, but she didn't fall. She pressed her palms against the fence rail, Midnight pressing close on the other side, his breath warming her skin through the slats. She closed her eyes, letting the sound of him steady her heartbeat. Sam finally broke the silence, his voice low but certain. "She made her choice, and I reckon we'd just better honor it." The townsfolk drifted away, murmurs soft as they returned to their lives. Lucy slipped to Emily's side, slipping her hand into hers. Emily squeezed back, wordless gratitude pouring through the touch. The sun blazed high now, the shadows shrinking. Emily stood between the corral and the ranch house, her body still trembling, but inside something had shifted forever. For the first time in her life, she had chosen where she belonged, and spoken it for all to hear. The dust of Emily's mother's departure had barely settled when a different kind of silence took hold on the Carter ranch. It was not the silence of fear, nor the hush of shame, but something heavier. Expectation. People had seen the girl choose her place, and the stallion respond like a shadow of her will. Whispers lingered on porches, in feed stores, at church pews. She belongs with that horse. Maybe the horse belongs with her. Sam Carter kept his thoughts close, but each day afterward he found himself watching Emily more than he admitted. He saw her rising early, drifting to the corral with no hesitation. Midnight, once a storm trapped in a pen, now met her with a lowered head, ears soft, muscles no longer quivering with violence. She would sit in the dirt, humming songs she half remembered, while the black giant stood guard like a sentinel. When she left, he followed her to the fence, eyes fixed until she vanished from view. Hank didn't hide his disgust. "It ain't natural," he muttered often, kicking dust at the ground. "That girl's got something over him." Trickery, I'd bet. Or worse. But his words held less power now. The men had seen too much, and none dared risk stepping into the corral to prove him right or wrong. One evening, as the sky burned orange over the hills, Sam stood with his wife Margaret on the porch. She had said little during the storm of gossip, choosing instead to watch with her sharp, kind eyes. She sipped her tea and spoke at last, her voice quiet but firm. That girl has given him peace. And him. He's given her something no one else has. Maybe it's not about breaking beasts anymore, Sam. Maybe it's about healing. Sam stared out at the corral, where Emily leaned against the rails, her small hand pressed to the wood, Midnight's breath rising steady behind the slats. He thought of the way her mother's car had torn down the road, leaving her with nothing but a choice and a horse. He thought of the hunger he'd seen in her face, not just for food, but for belonging. Healing, he repeated, the word rough in his throat. That night he sat at the kitchen table long after the lamps had burned low. Old ledgers lay open before him, records of cattle sold, debts paid, horses traded. Line after line measured worth in dollars and pounds. Yet none of it accounted for the black stallion still alive in the corral, or for the girl who had staked her whole soul to keep him. At last he closed the books and whispered, to the dark, "It's time." The next morning, he gathered the hands. Hank scowled before Sam even spoke, sensing what was coming. The others leaned on shovels and fence posts, waiting. Sam set his jaw. This ranch has been run one way for a long time, cattle, crops, and horses that earn their keep. But maybe we've been blind. That stallion out there, and the girl. His voice caught, but he pressed on. They've shown us something we can't measure. From today, this place will have a new purpose. A refuge. Not just for him, but for any horse that's been thrown aside. The men shifted, exchanging looks. Hank spat into the dust. A refuge? You're turning this place into a charity? For beasts that ought to be put down? Sam's eyes hardened. I've put down more animals than I care to remember, Hank. Some needed it, some didn't. But this one's still fighting. And she's fighting for him. If a girl who's had nothing can still see worth in what others call useless, then maybe she sees clearer than the rest of us. Margaret stepped forward then, her hand light on her husband's arm. We'll call it Haven Ranch, she said, her gaze sweeping the yard. A place where no creature is cast off without a chance to be whole again. The word settled over the men like a dusting of rain after drought. Some frowned, some nodded slowly, but no one argued further. By the week's end, the change had begun. Old stalls were repaired, new troughs built. A lame mare from a neighboring farm arrived first, ribs showing through her hide. Emily watched her stagger into the paddock, her eyes bright with tears. Midnight stood tall in his corral, ears flicked forward, as if recognizing a fellow exile. Emily spent her days darting between the pens, tending the newcomers with clumsy but eager hands. She whispered to them the way she did to Midnight, her voice carrying patience no one had ever given her. She told the blind gelding that the sun was warm, even if he couldn't see it. She told the mare with scars that scars were proof of survival. And when the townsfolk passed by the ranch, curiosity pulling them toward the fences, they saw something they hadn't expected. Not chaos, not danger, but quiet transformation. The wild stallion no longer hurled himself against the rails. The stray girl no longer drifted unseen through alleys. Together, they had become the heart of a place newly named, a place where broken things found room to mend. Still, whispers lingered. Some said it was witchcraft, others a fluke. Hank muttered that it was bound to end in blood. But for Emily, none of that mattered. Each time Midnight pressed his muzzle into her palm, Each time a horse too weary to lift its head found comfort in her voice, she knew she had chosen right. And as the sun set over Haven Ranch, painting the sky in fire and gold, Emily stood at the fence with dust on her face and hope in her chest, watching the black stallion breathe easy for the first time in his life. The days following the christening of Haven Ranch felt like a fragile dawn after a long storm. Horses with scars, limps, or eyes clouded with blindness began to arrive from neighboring farms. Emily poured herself into caring for them, moving from pen to pen with hands that shook less each day and a voice that grew steadier with every whisper of comfort she gave. Midnight remained the anchor, the black sentinel whose calm around her had become legend. Yet peace never sits long on land where doubt grows. Hank's bitterness deepened like a splinter that wouldn't work its way out. He spat his words in corners of the barn, stirring unease among the workers. "It ain't right," he muttered. "That stallion only listens to her. It's not respect, it's a spell. One day he'll show his teeth again, and when he does, you'll wish you'd listened to me." His warnings carried weight with some, especially the younger hands who had seen too many injuries from wilder stock. One afternoon, while Sam was away meeting a supplier, Hank decided to prove his point. The yard was quiet, the sun fierce overhead. Emily was bent over a trough cleaning it when she noticed Hank walking toward Midnight's corral, rope in hand. She froze, water dripping from the rag in her grip. "What are you doing?" she called, her voice high and sharp. Hank didn't look back. "Proving the truth," he said, swinging the gate open. His boots ground against the dirt as he stepped inside. Midnight's head shot up, ears flat, muscles rippling. The stallion's body coiled with fury, hooves stomping a warning. Emily dropped the rag and scrambled toward the fence, panic tightening her chest. "Stop! You can't go in there like that!" But Hank only laughed, bitter and hard. "If this horse is truly tame, it shouldn't matter who's in here. If he ain't, then we'll see just how much of your fairy tale holds." He moved closer, rope swinging loose at his side. Midnight's breath came in great bursts, nostrils flaring, eyes white with alarm. In an instant, he reared, slamming his hooves into the earth so hard the ground shook. Hank cursed and stumbled back, but pride pinned his feet. "See!" he shouted. "Devil through and through!" Emily couldn't breathe. Without thinking, she hauled herself over the fence, landing clumsily inside the pen. Dust billowed around her as she stumbled forward. "Midnight!" she cried, her voice cutting like a bell. The stallion froze. His ears flicked toward her, his chest heaving. Emily stepped closer, her palms out, her whole body trembling. "It's me." "It's all right. You're safe." Time seemed to stretch thin. Then, slowly, impossibly, Midnight lowered his hooves and let out a deep, shuddering sigh. He swung his great head toward Emily, pressing his muzzle into her shoulder. Her knees nearly buckled with relief as she wrapped her arms around his neck, burying her face in his mane. Behind her, Hank stood gaping, the rope limp in his hand. The other ranch hands had gathered at the fence, drawn by the commotion. Their faces reflected shock, disbelief, even awe. Not one of them had ever seen the stallion submit. Not until now. Not until the girl no one had wanted stepped between him and danger. Sam's voice rang out suddenly from behind the crowd. He had returned sooner than expected and stood with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. "You done proving your point, Hank?" he asked, his voice low but sharp enough to cut. Hank's face flushed. He opened his mouth, but no words came. At last he dropped the rope and shoved past the others, storming across the yard with his shoulders stiff. Sam climbed onto the fence, his eyes locked on Emily. She still held Midnight, her small frame dwarfed by the black mass of muscle and power beside her. The stallion stood calm, breathing in rhythm with her, his head lowered as if he belonged nowhere else but in her care. "You see it now, don't you?" one of the men whispered. "It's her." Only her Sam's jaw tightened. He had known it in his bones, but witnessing it stripped away the last of his doubt. Midnight wasn't broken, not in the way ranchers meant. He hadn't been tamed by rope or whip. He had chosen the girl no one else had wanted, and in doing so, he had revealed a truth about both of them. Emily lifted her head, meeting Sam's gaze across the distance. Her face was streaked with dust, her eyes fierce but wet. She expected anger, maybe punishment for climbing into the pen again. Instead, Sam tipped his hat and said simply, "Looks like he trusts you more than he ever will the rest of us." "We'll work with that." The men dispersed slowly, muttering among themselves. Some shook their heads, others nodded as though conceding defeat. But the image burned into their minds would not fade. The wild stallion bent to the will of a girl who had nothing but the strength of her heart. As the yard returned to its rhythm, Emily stayed in the corral, her arms around Midnight's neck, her cheek pressed against his warm coat. For the first time, she felt not just seen, but believed. And in the quiet thrum of his heartbeat against her ear, she knew she had passed a trial greater than any rope or whip could set. The trial of trust. The weeks after Hank's failed attempt to prove Emily wrong reshaped Haven Ranch in ways no one had expected. What began as whispers in the town about a cursed horse and a stray girl grew into murmurs of respect. People who had once crossed the street to avoid Emily now slowed their wagons when passing the ranch, craning their necks for a glimpse of the unlikely pair. Midnight had become more than a story. He was a symbol. And Emily, always on the edges of other people's lives, was now standing in the very center of one. Each day brought new arrivals. Horses deemed useless by their owners stumbled through the ranch gates. A chestnut mare with a leg that never healed right. A gray gelding with one clouded eye. A foal whose ribs showed too clearly beneath thin skin. Sam Carter took them all in. He gave orders to mend fences, build extra stalls, and expand the pastures. But it was Emily who gave the animals something beyond shelter. She rose with the sun and stayed until the last light faded. Her hands blistered, her clothes dust-streaked. She hummed to the frightened ones, whispered to the ones who kicked and balked, and sat quietly with the ones who seemed beyond reach. Midnight followed her like a shadow when allowed, his black figure towering beside her. To the newcomers, his calm presence was a strange kind of reassurance. If the fiercest of them all had found peace here, maybe they could too. Lucy became Emily's constant companion. Where once she had lingered on the edges, curious and hesitant, now she carried buckets, fetched brushes, and asked questions with wide-eyed eagerness. The two girls laughed sometimes, though Emily's laughter was soft, still learning its way. They shared apples under the cottonwoods, spoke of dreams they hadn't dared voice before. Lucy of traveling someday. Emily of nothing more grand than having a bed that was hers alone. The townsfolk, at first skeptical, began to bring offerings. Old blankets, sacks of grain, tools they no longer needed. Some came quietly, leaving items by the fence at night. Others came boldly, curious to see the miracle themselves. "Is it true?" they asked. "Will he let her touch him?" And Emily, shy but steady, would show them. Midnight lowered his head to her palm, his massive body softening in her presence. Every time, gasps followed, a silence thick with something like reverence. But not everyone was convinced. Hank still muttered that it was dangerous, that one day the stallion's true nature would return, and Emily would be trampled. His words carried less weight now, though, because every man who had seen her with Midnight knew the truth Hank refused to accept. The bond was real, and it was unbreakable. Even so, his bitterness hung like a storm cloud, threatening from the edges. Emily herself changed in ways she hadn't expected. She was no longer the invisible girl scraping for scraps in alleys. She had purpose, routine, and the strange comfort of being needed. The horses looked for her. Midnight waited for her, and even Sam Carter, gruff as he was, began to nod at her with something like respect. Margaret, his wife, brought Emily into the kitchen one evening and placed a plate of warm cornbread in front of her. "You belong here," she said simply. Emily's throat ached too much to answer, but she ate every bite, tears blurring her vision. The transformation of the ranch was noticed far beyond Willow Creek. Travelers passing through heard the stories and stopped to see for themselves. A man from the next county brought a mare that had been beaten and declared worthless. He watched in stunned silence as Emily stood quietly near her until the mare, trembling, lowered her head into the girl's hand. "Never seen anything like it," he whispered. He left without payment, but with a look in his eyes that carried more than money ever could. Still, Emily carried a weight inside. The image of her mother's return lingered. The harsh voice declaring ownership, the empty promise of home. She knew the woman could come back, might even bring the sheriff or papers to prove her claim. The thought gnawed at Emily late at night when the barn was still and the horse's breathing was the only sound. She would slip from her bedroll and lean against the fence, her forehead pressed to the rail. Midnight would come, pressing close, and in his steady presence, she found the courage to believe she could fight again if she had to. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in streaks of rose and gold, Sam gathered the hands by the barn. The yard smelled of hay and sweat, of horses settling for the night. He stood tall, his voice carrying over the crackle of cicadas. "This place is different now. It's not just a ranch, it's a refuge. And anyone who doubts it can leave." His eyes flicked to Hank, who scowled but said nothing. "From here on, we stand for those no one else will." That's what Haven Ranch means. The men shifted, some nodding, some silent. Emily stood among them, her small frame dwarfed by the weight of the moment. She felt the words settle deep inside her, not just as a command, but as a promise. Later, she sat in the dirt beside Midnight, the stallion lying with his legs folded beneath him, his head resting near her knees. She stroked the rough strands of his mane, whispering, "We've both risen from dust, you and me. Maybe now we get to stay." The stars pricked through the darkening sky, and for the first time, Emily believed they weren't just distant fires, but something closer, something meant for her, for them. The summer stretched long and golden over Haven Ranch, each day etched into memory by the rhythm of hooves and the smell of sun-warmed hay. The ranch was no longer simply a place of work. It had become something alive, carrying whispers of transformation through every fence post and stall. Travelers stopped on the road to gaze at the black stallion grazing peacefully, the same horse they once feared would kill a man. Children pressed their noses to the fence rails, waiting to catch a glimpse of the girl who had turned myth into truth. Emily grew into her place quietly. She no longer drifted like a shadow between alleys and barns. Her hands were blistered, her clothes stained, but her eyes were steady. She worked alongside the men, small but tireless, and though Hank still muttered under his breath, he no longer dared step into Midnight's pen. Lucy spent nearly every afternoon at her side, carrying buckets, laughing when the foal tried to nibble her braids. Together, the girls stitched themselves into the fabric of a ranch that now bore the name Haven. Midnight changed, too. He carried his scars in silence, but the fury that once raged through him had thinned into a deep, steady strength. Around Emily, he was watchful, calm, his massive head lowered, as if acknowledging that the ground they stood on belonged to them both. To others, he remained a mystery, untouchable. But when Emily stepped into the corral, he moved to her instantly, his breath stirring her hair like a familiar greeting. It was on one of those evenings when the sky turned the color of fire and copper that the moment came. The ranch hands had finished their work and leaned against the rails, their silhouettes etched against the horizon. Sam Carter stood near the barn, arms crossed, his expression solemn but softened with something close to pride. Margaret watched from the porch, her hands clasped, her heart caught in her throat. Emily entered the corral as she always did, her feet bare, her steps quiet. Midnight approached, ears forward, his shadow stretching long in the fading light. She pressed her palm to his neck, whispering words only he could hear. Then, with a courage that had been building for months, she placed a foot against his side, gripped his mane, and pulled herself onto his back. The yard fell silent. There was no saddle, no bridle, no rope. Just a girl and a horse, bound by something invisible but undeniable. Midnight shifted his weight, his muscles tense for a moment, and then he stilled. Emily sat upright, her thin frame outlined against the glowing sky, her hair lifted by the evening breeze. She laid a hand gently against his neck. "It's just us," she whispered. Midnight took a step, then another. The sound of his hooves echoed through the yard, slow and deliberate. The men at the fence held their breath, and Lucy clutched the wood so tightly her knuckles whitened. Sam's eyes glistened with something he would never name aloud. Emily guided nothing, commanded nothing. She only trusted. And Midnight, for the first time, carried someone not with resistance, but with choice. He circled the corral, his head low, his stride steady, the dust rising around them like smoke. The sun bled into the horizon, casting them both in a halo of light. Gasps gave way to silence again, but this time it was reverent, as though every person present understood they were witnessing something beyond skill or training. It wasn't conquest. It was communion. When Midnight stopped, he lowered his head, breathing hard but calm. Emily slid down slowly, her bare feet meeting the dust with a whisper. She pressed her forehead to his muzzle, tears streaking her cheeks, not from fear but from the weight of the moment. Sam stepped forward, his voice rough. "This horse stays. As long as I live, he stays." And so does she. Applause broke out. Not loud, not raucous, but steady, like rain falling after a drought. Lucy wiped her eyes. Margaret covered her mouth with trembling hands, and even the men who had doubted bowed their heads. Emily stood with Midnight beside her, her hand resting on his neck. For the first time, she lifted her chin to meet the world's gaze. She was no longer invisible. No longer the stray who slipped between shadows. She was the girl who had chosen where she belonged, and the girl a wild stallion had chosen in return. As the last light of the sun sank behind the ridge, Emily walked Midnight out of the corral. They moved together into the fields, their shadows stretching long over the dust, bound forever in a story that Willow Creek would tell for generations. A girl and a horse, risen from dust and despair, riding not with reins, but with trust. And as twilight claimed the sky, the ranch carried a new silence, not of fear, not of judgment, but of reverence. Haven Ranch had become what its name promised: a refuge, a beginning, a home. If this story touched your heart, don't leave in silence. Drop a simple 0 or 1 in the comments to let us know you're here with us. Your words keep these stories alive. And if you haven't yet, hit subscribe, because the next story may be the one that changes the way you see the bond between people and animals forever.